Hi, this is Eric, and this video will be about how to play pawn endgames. I think for most chess players, pawn endgames are one of the most confusing and difficult endgames simply because there's almost no, well, there is no piece play. You just have two kings going at it. It's all about passed pawns. Can you queen? Can you stop the opponent from queening? And there's so much concrete calculation that it confuses a lot of people. And because of that, so many very similar king and pawn endgames can just have one tiny difference, and one might be winning and one might be drawn. And for that reason, concrete positions and sort of established pawn endgame theory aren't that useful for most players outside of very, very simple cases. So I do want to make the point that in the book Applying Logic in Chess that I wrote, I tried to emphasize that endgames in general have two main things that we want to focus on. First of all, we are going to learn the most about endgames from our own games. A lot of that is because as we start to experience playing endgames, certain types of endgames in particular, for the first time, we'll notice, oh wow, I was up a lot of material, but I couldn't win in this certain type of endgame. Or, oh wow, it was equal material, I thought I would defend, but maybe I was too passive and the opponent was able to dominate my position. And so you get a very good feeling for when you're winning and when the position's drawn. And a lot of that, you can definitely learn a lot of that through books, but the most valuable experiences you'll have will be your own games, especially when you realize it for yourself. Some of it you'll realize it because your opponent played it out, and some of it you'll realize just from calculating it, just from thinking deeply about a particular endgame. Pawn endgames in particular are very, very difficult for that reason, because a lot of it, like I said, is very, very concrete and calculation based. So the other point I want to make relating to endgames is that a lot of endgames we're going to study in the context of studying classic games or studying from games collections. So we're just simply going to see a lot of endgames that way. And the other point is that because so many of these endgames simply do not lend themselves to, let's say if you have 6 pieces on the board for each side, it's very uncommon for that exact 6-piece versus 6-piece position to occur in one of your games, for example, that you saw in a book. So a lot of what you're going to use are simple strategies you've seen before, concepts you've seen before, and you're going to be relying heavily on calculation. And tying that into pawn endgames, I want to mention the most useful tip that I know of, and that is very useful, and you'll be able to see it in 9 examples here. You'll be able to see that in a whole bunch of different pawn endgames, not all of them, but in a lot of them, there will be races, and there are two main things to pay attention to. The first is who wins the race, and the second is where are the kings. For instance, let's say there's a race to queen. The question is going to be where are the kings when the queening takes place. Because if you're queening with check, that's very valuable. That gives you a crucial tempo. So let's get into it, and let's get into who wins the race. So basically, in this position right here, actually this position somewhat comically comes from a Hikaru Nakamura puzzle rush, where he's just thought for a couple seconds and bashed out King A3. So I want to point out how we can be certain of who wins the race here by simply counting how many moves are we away from pawn promotion. And so by doing that, that'll make it quite a lot easier. So the point here is that if you have to calculate everything, if there are many moves to promotion, you're not going to be able to easily calculate out 14 moves. Let's say it's 14 moves for you and 14 for the opponent. Imagine that you're trying to keep track of that in your head, and you go, oh, I'm 14 moves away, and my opponent is 14 moves away, and you're trying to keep track of it, and what if you just miss one move? If you miss one tempo, you might lose the game based on that one tempo. So the easiest way to do it is to count how many moves it is for each side separately. So if you're calculating, you're going move by move. Okay, I go here, he goes there, but in terms of actually just simply counting it, there it's much easier. We're just counting the number of moves for each side in a row, and allowing ourselves to simply know who wins the race that way. So that is a key point in terms of awareness. We have an awareness of who's winning the race or not. And a lot of that matters throughout all of chess. For instance, in playing normal middle games, it's useful to know, well, what's undefended, what's a tactical weakness. And in king and pawn endgames, it's very, very useful to be aware of A, who wins the race, and B, where are the king positions. So I've heard the criticism of counting that, well, the problem is counting isn't everything. And even if you can count everything, well, what about if there's a check? Or what about if one of the kings is vulnerable? Well, that's exactly why we tie in caring about the respective king positions. So it's basically like you're improving on a basic idea of the importance of counting. And so in this case, it's just an awareness. We're aware of who wins the race, and we're aware of where the kings are. And when we are aware of those two things, it's very, very valuable. This isn't everything related to pawn endgames. There is, of course, opposition, getting your king back in time. There are a number of different things. There's also shouldering. There are a whole bunch of different points to be aware of in pawn endgames. But in terms of calculating these key races, this is very, very important. So in this particular endgame right here, let's count. Let's try to count how many moves it takes for black to actually queen. So let's go move by move, okay? So here with black's king, black played king a3. How many moves is it to promote? 1. We take the pawn, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 6 moves for us to promote. 2 to grab the pawn, and then 4 from the 5th rank right here. So that's 6 moves. And how many moves is it for white? 1. And a good point to keep in mind here is that if the pawn is right here on the 1st rank, then it's 5 moves to promote. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what that means is after king to a3, we're both promoting at the same time. So in that case, the problem is that the queen is coming in on b1 and the opponent's queen is coming in on h8, and neither of the kings are being checked. So that actually would only end in a draw. So let me play out that line. So if king a3, king g4, take, here, here. So we can see that it's 6-6. The only important thing to realize in that case, after queen, queen, the important thing to realize in this case is that because it was 6-6 for both sides, that meant that because black moved first, black queened first, and then white queened on the next move. So we can see in this line that both sides are queening at the same time. First black and then white. Well, let's say we go back to the beginning again. Is there a faster way to try to queen? Well, what if we just push the c pawn? So remember this point that I said about the pawn being initially on, let's say, the 2nd rank or the 3rd rank? Well, that's 5 moves. So we actually already know, without even counting anything, without even calculating anything, that this pawn queens first. So this pawn just rolls straight up the board. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for the opponent, it's 6. So what that means is if I play c5, they go king g3, I go c4, take, take, they go h4, I go c3, h5, c2, queen, h7. And the point is, because it was 5 moves for me and 6 for them, since black was going first, that meant that black queened while white was 1 move away from promotion. And you see, I realized that without even actually making any moves. I'm aware that here, after making this move, I'm 4 moves away from promotion. The opponent is 6 moves away from promotion, and that's the key point there. 4 versus 6. So that means that by the time their pawn reaches h7, I already have a queen on the board. So it turns out that this is actually a pretty simple point, and it's pretty simple to know whether this is winning or not. And it's interesting to compare, just when you compare the king a3 move, which took 6 moves, versus the c5 move, which took 5 moves, we can immediately see, being 1 tempo faster, this wins for black. So that's a very interesting point, and it's actually something really simple that even a very strong grandmaster could make a mistake about. And actually, they could even make that mistake in a blitz game or maybe even a rapid game. So the book Endgame Tragicomedies by Mark Dvoretsky has many such types of mistakes. So let's go on to the next one. The next one is also a typical case. So this position occurred in one of my students' games, and here we have an interesting situation. Here we have another race that's occurring. So it's white to move, and now white has to make a decision. Do I run after the h7 pawn, or do I try to advance my pawns kind of in a fancy way? Well, let's try to figure out what happens here. Let's try to count. So how many moves does it take for white to capture both of black's pawns? King g5, king h6, king takes h7, king takes g6. It's 4 moves. How many moves does it take for black to take both of the pawns? King d2, king e2, king f2, king takes g2, king takes h2. It's 5 moves. Again, we have the exact same issue as before. Here we can see, without even calculating anything, that white will take the g6 pawn at the same time that the g2 pawn is captured, and then white just rolls the h pawn forward. King g5, king d2, king h6, king e2, take, king f2, take, and because we were able to keep our last pawn, we're able to push our h pawn forward, and white wins. The pawn just rolls up the board, and the pawn queens. So let's go back and see that again. So the key point here is that we have a race. White is running after the black pawns, and black is running after the white pawns. And here, the only point that we have to see here is that we're able to capture the g6 pawn while still keeping our last pawn on h2. And by keeping that last pawn, we're able to throw that pawn up the board and queen it. And so what happened in the game, white tried to be a bit more fancy, and the problem is, if you have a straightforward win by just running after the pawns and then queening your own, that's always going to be the easiest path. If you can just immediately grab material and queen, that's going to be the fastest way. What happened was white played g4, and the problem was the opponent's king was able to come back. And when the king came back, the king was able to box the white king in. So once this position is reached, there's a very important point to make here. When the black king is able to come back to this key square on, in this case, it'll be f8, but when the king can come to f7 or f8 and lock the king in, then the black king only needs to come into the corner, and the king will never be able to chase out. It's only going to be a draw. So that was the problem in the game. The problem in the game is that white tried to be really fancy, thinking, well, maybe I can advance my pawns up because my king is in a more active position. But simply put, had white just counted the race, they would have realized, oh, well, I'm going to win the g6 pawn. By the time that they win the g2 pawn, I have my h2 pawn left over. So I'm winning the race here. It takes me 4 moves. It takes them 4 moves. But by the time that they take g2, I have my h2 pawn, and I win the game. So this was just a simple case of just being aware of who wins the race. White wins the race, and the pawn goes up and queens. So let's go on and look at the next one. Okay, here's another interesting one. Here's another interesting one with white to move. The key point to realize here when playing with white is how many moves until you actually queen. So for instance, let's say there were more pieces on the board, because actually in this game there were more pieces on the board. And it was mainly a question for white, should I go into a king and pawn endgame? That'll be a big question you'll have in a lot of your games. Should you go into a king and pawn endgame? And in this case, if white was going to enter this king and pawn endgame, the key question would be, is it possible to draw this endgame? What's the evaluation of this endgame? And how do we figure that out? Well, black's most dangerous pawn is the h pawn, the pawn on h5 trying to go down to h1. So the key here for white is realizing how many moves until they queen. And in this case, we can count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we count it for black, 1, 2, and notice, because the pawn is on the 4th rank for black, it's still 4 more moves. So it's 2 moves to take the pawn, and then 4 moves to actually queen it. So even though the king maybe visually might look like it's in a very strong position, it still takes 6 moves to actually queen it. So what that means is, let's say I just advance my pawns up. I go here, take, here. So we already actually know that we're queening at the same time. So that's what happens. White queens first. It was 6 versus 6. So what it means, if you have an equal number, if it's 6-6, then it means that you queen first and then the opponent queens on the very next move. So this was one of those cases in which, had white realized just that it was 6 moves to queen, and it's also 6 moves for black, then they would have been able to draw the game. They would have been able to go into this endgame without fear. So in a lot of these endgames, a lot of pawn endgames come down to races, and in these particular cases we've seen, the king positions have not mattered. The king's positions haven't mattered, and the square in which the pawn was promoted on didn't matter either, because the promoting queen wasn't able to stop the opponent from promoting. So in all these cases, we've had some pretty clear-cut cases. So the key point here was, had white simply been aware of what happens in this race, 6-6, white could have confidently gone into this pawn endgame without fear. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, here we have an interesting case. Here we have one of these cases in which black is about to run the king over to the queen side and grab the pawn. What do you think? Is black able to win the game, or is it a draw? This is another case of counting, but one which you might say is a little bit more complicated, because we have to know what is the exact race to. What is the goal of this race? Well, a point that we saw earlier is the goal of the race here is for the black king to be able to box out white's king. Basically, white's king is trying to come back to these squares, particularly the C1 square. If the king can come back here, then this will be a draw. If the king can come all the way back to that A1 square, he'll be able to draw. So it completely comes down to that. So let's see if we can count this. How many moves is the black king away from blocking the king from coming to C1? That is the key square right here. The C1 square is the key square, because if the king can come back here, then the king can slide over here. So as long as the king can come back to that key C1 square, this will be a draw. Well, how many moves is black away from controlling it? Let's count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so black goes first and he's 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See that? So what that means is that it takes black 8 moves and it takes white 7 moves to come back. So that means in this particular case, even though black is going first, it means that in this particular case, now it's 7-7, but white is first. So white wins the race to C1. You see how that happens? King H4, King E4. I'll go back to show this again. King F3, King E3, take. King D2, and notice the king comes back just in time. And see what happens here. After A4, we have King B1. King comes into the corner, and it's stalemate. So black is not able to make any progress. And the other point is that if they try to box us out with King A2, we just go King C2. The king can't get out of the way of the pawn. So that's exactly the problem here. If they try to play like this, we just repeat, and again we have a stalemate. So what's really interesting about this case is that these types of endgames are probably more complicated than you may have thought they were, but the thing is, I'm not even calculating it. I already know the outcome of this endgame by relying on very simple heuristics that are 100% reliable. In this kind of endgame, it's 100% reliable. I know that if my king comes back to C1 in time, I'm going to draw this. And so after that King F5 move, I'm going, well, it's 7-7 in that race, but I'm first. So by going first, I'm coming to C1 while their king is on B3. And it's very fascinating that you can know that without even calculating it. It's just merely by knowing who wins that race. So 7 for black, 7 for white, but white's going first. If black went first here, black would win. That's the very fascinating part of it. So if it was 7-7 and black was going first, black would be the winner. So let's go on to the next one. Next one will be very similar to this. Here we have another case We have a slightly more complicated case because here white actually does have to come up and steal the pawn, but the king does have a straight shot all the way back to c1. So let's count how many moves this is, because notice that the black king is also going to be further back. So let's count how many moves this is. It's black to move first here. So black's first move, okay, I'm just making the moves. I'll remove the arrows here just to make it simpler. So in this case, how many moves is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, it's 8 moves. How many moves is it for white? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, we have another 8, 7. And here we have the exact same situation as in the previous one. We're getting back to our key square for our king to be able to block the pawn is c1. We have another 7, 7 case. We're going first, so we are drawing this position. And again, we know this without calculating anything. And that makes it way easier. You could imagine if you weren't aware of this during the game, your head would be spinning. You'd be going, oh, is my king getting back in time? King e5, king h5, king d5, king takes. You're just getting very confused. But if you're aware here, you just go, oh, well, okay, 7, 7, I'm going first. So I'm going to make it back here. King h5, king d5, take, king g5, king f4, king e3, king b4, king d2, exactly the same as in the previous one. King to b3, king c1, we make it back to our key safe square, and now our king makes it into the corner, and we're able to draw. So a very, very important point, because you'll see this a lot. You'll see this in a lot of your games where there will be a rook pawn that the opposing king can win, and you need to make sure, well, am I able to draw this or not? So this is one of those cases in which the white king is able to come back and draw. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, here's another interesting case. Here's another funny case. So in the game, this was played. And so white had to calculate what happens if I go into this endgame. Let's make it a little harder for ourselves and leave the knight on the board and try to count it. So imagine that you're just kind of, playing this position at the board and trying to count it. Let's see if we can count it without making any arrows, okay? So let's imagine the black king is on f4. So how many moves is the black king away from the c1 square? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 away. And how many moves is white away from winning h4 and then coming back to c1? h3, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in this particular case, the king is too far away. It's 6 for black and 7 for white. So this is actually very important because black is winning the pawn on that key square. Bishop takes f4, king takes f4. I'll just count it for you here. So it's white to move. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's white to move and it's 7. For black, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's white to move first, and so technically after white makes the move, king to h3, we have another case of 6, 6, black going first, black wins. And it's all because the pawn is captured on this key square. The important point is that if the pawn was captured on a4, this would not be a draw. Actually, if the pawn was captured on a4, I mean this would be a draw. This would be a draw because the white king would be able to come back. So king takes h4, king d3, king g3, king c3, king f3, king e3, king takes. Have one little mini trick here. King d3, king to b3, taking the opposition. The white king cannot move around the black king. So after king d2, the simple king b2, and that finishes things off. Now the a pawn just runs forward. There's no way to stop. As you can see, the king can't come around to stop it. So the pawn just comes down and queens. So this is a very, very helpful tip. You only have to realize that in any case like this, especially if the question is, can I stop the pawn? If there's a case of you being 6 moves away, the opponent being 6 moves away, If you are on move, you're stopping that pawn. If it's the opponent's move and it's again a 6-6 situation, the opponent will win. And in this case, that's exactly what happens. After king h3, it's 6-6, but black to move, so black wins. It's a very, very important point in these types of cases, because if you're trying to calculate this type of thing, especially, if you have, let's say, 30-second increment per move, let's say it's your opponent's move and they're calculating, the board awareness element is the most important point here. So if you're simply playing this with black and just going, oh, okay, well, I can see that I'm 6 moves away and they're 6 moves away, so I can see in this position, let's say you're calculating before white's move, which they'll almost definitely play king h3, and you're realizing, okay, after king h3 is played, I'm 6 moves away, they're 6 moves away, so yeah, I just run after the pawn, I take it, and I'm winning. Especially if you're deciding on this earlier. Let's say you're deciding on this earlier in the game. Should I go into this endgame? Because, to be honest, if you're playing this endgame at the board, with black, you don't have anything else to do anyway, besides running after the pawn. So, it's kind of an easy question. Of course, some people could think, oh, well, maybe I might want to advance my pawn forward or something. But in this particular case, as you can see, it's easy to figure out. I shouldn't fool around with anything. Run my king over. I can easily see I'm winning. Makes the whole thing much, much easier. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, here's another one, another typical case. So what's going on in this endgame here? 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 5. Okay, white's up a pawn, and black is about to take a pawn on a2. So one thing that I mentioned before, which is really useful to keep in mind in terms of counting, just to make your counting even easier, if the pawn is on the 2nd or 3rd rank, you're 5 moves away from queening. If it's on the 4th rank, you're 4 moves away. 3 moves away, 2 moves away, 1 move away. So it really depends where the pawn is, but if you know where the pawn is, you know exactly how many moves you are away from queening. So for example, this black pawn right here, this black pawn on b4, it's 1, 2, 3 moves away from queening. And so the point here from white's point of view is, what do I play in this pawn endgame? What should I be trying to do here? Well, the very interesting point is that if you're aware, just looking at this position, you can see that because the pawn is on g2, you are 5 moves away. And the opponent is 6 moves away, because here's the point. Here's the point. So if I push the pawn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm 5 moves away from queening. And by the way, it doesn't make any difference in the counting if there's an exchange played, because that exchange does not assist black at all in him queening. So this doesn't change anything in the calculation or in figuring out who wins the race. So we are 5 moves away. Black has 1, 2, then they have to spend a tempo moving their king out of the way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what we know from this is white is to move, and it's 5 moves. For the opponent, it's 6. So again, what do we know? We know that we are queening first, and by the time that we queen, the opponent will only have their king out of the way and their pawn down to the 7th rank. So what that means is, let's say I play g4. Let's say they take. I take, f6 here, f7, b3, queen. So I know that I'm queening, and by the time I queen, their next move will not queen. It will only put the pawn on b2. And the nice thing about this little feature here is that in realizing this, you can go, oh, well, actually, I could even just give up my queen if I want to. Let's say I just give up my queen here. I give up my queen and just advance my pawn straight down, and I'm going to create a new queen. So in playing g4, the great thing about this line here is that I already know that I'm winning. I already know that I'm completely winning without even calculating anything, because I'm 5 moves away from queening, they're 6 moves away from queening, and so I'm going to queen first when their pawn hasn't queened yet. So that's one of those cases where the key element there is I already know that I'm winning the race. So let me go on to the next one. Okay, here's another typical case. Another typical case, white is to move, and white's key point here is to calculate what happens if I run after the d6 pawn and just try to queen. What happens if I directly run forward and try to queen? The big question is, if I run after d6 and they run after g3 and try to queen, who's faster? This pawn has 3 moves to go. This pawn has 4 moves to go. Both kings will spend 1 move getting out of the way. So we have to figure out who's faster here. Well, let's just simply count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What about for black? So basically, what we're doing there is we're going 1, 2, 3. We're spending 3 moves capturing the pawn, 1 move getting out of the way, and 3 moves pushing the pawn. And for black, 1, 2, 3. 1 move getting out of the way. So both kings are spending 3 moves chasing down the pawn. They're spending 1 move getting out of the way. But, as you can see in this case, white is 1 move faster. So white is 1 move faster because his pawn is 1 square further advanced. So I've already counted here that for black, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's still 4 more moves from queening. So it's 3 moves winning the pawn, 1 move moving out of the way, and 4 moves queening it. So I already know it's 7 versus 8, and white's moving first. So king f5, king h5, king e6, take. King takes g3, simply king e5. Push the pawn, g6, g4, d7, g3, queen, and again, we have our ideal situation right here. We have succeeded in queening before the opponent queens. And so here we play queen f6 check, and white has a completely winning position. So another case where without any calculation, we've realized, oh, okay, so for me it's going to be 7, for them it's going to be 8, I'm moving first. So I'm winning the race, and I'm queening, and by the time that I queen, their pawn will be on the 6th rank, and the next move moving down to the 7th rank, so I get a whole free extra tempo, but I already know that I'm winning. And notice the key point here, no calculation needed. I know I'm 7 moves away from promotion, they're 8 moves away from promotion. Made it all very simple for us. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So here we have a hard one. This one is very, very difficult. This is one that was played by Robert James Fisher, Bobby Fischer, in the Mar del Plata International in 1959. And this was actually a king and pawn endgame that he managed to lose. And the interesting fact is that it's actually winning for white. But what's so complicated about this endgame is that all the little details matter. And I'm not going to ask you to count it all out from the start, but let's make a few moves first and then go back and then try to understand this, because this is clearly the most complicated one that I've got here. So bishop takes f6, king takes f6. Okay, white plays king e4, activating the king. King e4, king e6. Okay, so with this very complicated position on the board, the best move for white is to prepare to try to promote by playing g4. So after g4, a5, we reach another kind of typical situation where we have to kind of figure out, okay, if I play the move a4 and they play b4, what happens in that case? We're going to have a very difficult situation where, let's say a4, b4, king to d3, king to d5. Okay, here's a very typical complex situation. So we have to decide, all right, if I want to try to run over to the queen side and take that a5 pawn, who is faster? How many moves is it going to take them? Notice, let's remember our key points here that make it much easier to count. This pawn is 4 moves away from promotion. This pawn is 5 moves away from promotion. Again, 4 versus 5 in that case. So white's pawn is a bit faster. In this case, a very nice move is to fix that pawn on g6. And so imagine trying to calculate how far away each side is from actually promoting. So in this case, let's say black runs over and tries to win the pawn. Let's count how many moves we are. So assuming this move is played, white's king has access to c4. Let's see how many moves this is. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's 4 moves, and 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's 4, 4. So that's a very, very interesting case. But let's see what happens. So the king will already be here. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And in this case, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's count that again. So with white to move, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And with black to move, once the king is on e6, 1, 2, 3, 1 move spent moving out of the way. So this gets very complicated. So let's look at this. King to e6, king to c4, king to f5. So in this case, here's where the problem lies. So if we try to win this race here after king to b5, the problem that we experience here is that black has one extra possibility. And here's one of the main things that confuses us. So let's say you've just counted that. You've gone, okay, I'm 8 moves away. They're 9 moves away. I'm going to win this. Okay. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, black has a nasty trick in the mix here. And that trick is the move c4. And the point of the c4 move is that it decoys the white king a full move away. So what that means is after the king takes, when I take here, it completely changes the dynamic. Because now, let's count it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, and again, it's actually going to be a tie. Here, 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 take. And now both of the pawns are on the 4th rank. So they both queen at the same time. So an amazing case, a really amazing case. And this is why people tell you to be cautious when you're keeping track of this stuff. Because we counted how fast it was to chase after the pawn. But the key problem there was that when we counted it, we have to take account of the opponent's actual counterplay. Do they have a little trick that's going to make us waste more time? So that's why in this case, after king to e6, we have to be extremely careful. So remember, I mentioned 2 main things. Who wins the race and where are the kings? So the problem here is that white was technically faster, but the actual problem in that is that even though we were faster in this particular case, it didn't actually matter because black had a move that made us waste a full move. So it was originally 8 versus 9, but in this case it became 8-8. So they managed to actually kind of trick us. So a key point here is, well, do we have any ways to change this? Do we have any other concepts we can play? For example, can we try to promote when the opponent's king is very vulnerable? Let's say, notice that our pawn is promoting on the a8 square. Their pawn is promoting on the g1 square. Do we have a way to potentially promote with check? If we could promote with check with their king on f3, imagine that situation. Our king on f3, our king on d3, their king on f3, their queen on g1. That could put them in serious trouble because imagine that we get to play that check. What that could mean afterwards is that we might be able to, for example, directly trade queens. And we might be able to just go straight into a winning endgame after that. So the key problem that they experience there is that we just might be heading straight for a winning endgame. So let's look at this. Let's think about this. Because notice that the opponent's king is very boxed out. So let's think about this again. So we realized that if we run forward with king to b5, the problem there is when we run forward to b5, they have that tricky move c4. That is a great pawn endgame strategy and trap. It's a decoy. you're decoying the opponent's king to make them waste a full tempo. So let's recount this, assuming we're going to take the pawn. So king c4, king f5, king takes c5. Okay, so far so good. King takes g5. King takes f4, king to b5, king takes g5, king takes a5. King f4, king takes b4, g5. So here's the point. Basically, both of the kings will be queening at the same time, but what if I play king to c3? Because if I'm able to bring my king back to c3, one of the very nice tricks here is that when I bring my king back to c3, I can actually give them a full move. I can give them a full move there. Because if my king comes back just in time and makes it to d3, then their king, if they want to queen it, will be lured all the way out to f3. Let me just play out the moves so that I can illustrate it, and then we can go back. So king c4, king f5, take. I'm taking the pawn because I have to. King takes f4, king b5, king takes, king f4, king takes b4, g5, king c3. Here's a key point. We have this passed b pawn we're trying to escort home. So g4. So now we can see the pawns are queening at the same time, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. So essentially, if I try to just move forward first, they're going to queen at the same time. But I have a key move. The key move, so it's basically 4, 3, but white's moving first. So they're going to queen at the same time. Black will queen first. But I have the key move, king to d3. And this is a brilliant move, making use of the fact that we're thinking about where are the king positions. Basically, we're thinking about who wins the race, and when the race is won, where are the kings and where's the promotion taking place? Because if our promotion stops their promotion, that's very important. And it also, of course, matters where the actual king position is. So notice that they can't play this move, because if they play g3, our king comes back here, here, and our king is able to hide behind the pawn, and now we simply escort our pawn home. So the key point in this whole endgame is that if king f3 is played, now notice we're queening with check. That is so crucial here. So we're losing a full move. We're losing a full move by playing king c3. We've lost a full move, but what we've been able to do is we've been able to create a situation, a6, g2, a7, g1 queen, a8 queen check, king e4, check. Now notice this key point here. They have no way to avoid the exchange of queens. After king to g5, there's queen to e3 check. And our single pawn is able to win for one key reason. Queen e3 check, take, take. So here there's a race coming back. King to f5, king to d6, king to e6. So the key point here is that our king can come to this key b6 square. When our king is on b6 and the opponent's king is somewhere back here, b8 or c8, on either square, we will have a winning position. And so king c5, king d7, king b6, king c8, b4, king to b8, and now we simply play the move b5. And now they have a losing position. No matter where they go, we will simply bypass the king. So if they go here, the pawn just coasts forward and we queen and win. So it's a great endgame with multiple different concepts, but one of the key concepts for black was decoying the white king away so they gain a key tempo, and one of the key points for white was actually luring or decoying the black king to a vulnerable square. So let me go back and show that again from a much earlier point. So basically white can go into this endgame, go into this king and pawn endgame without any risk. King e4, king e6, g4, a5. So a key move, key tempo gaining move right here is this a4 move, and so after the key move we were looking at was b4, and so we get this key situation here, And this is a pretty complicated case, as I mentioned, with this g5 fixing move, because here we have this key problem that we have to, here it's a clearer situation to count it. Let's say we're counting the king takes c5 move. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So basically we're queening at the same time. You realize that you're queening at the same time, but the problem is we can't trade queens once we actually get a queen on the board and they get a queen on the board. So we only have a draw if we play the obvious moves. So the point is, are we able to lure their king to a bad square so that we can queen with check? So this is one of those really nice cases where both sides play a clever move or have a clever move in a key variation in order to make the opponent's king waste a tempo. And so in this case, in this line, we lure the opponent's king in g5, king to c3, key move. And as you can see, after we play king to c3, you can, okay, I'll illustrate what happens if we don't play that. g4, g3, queen, queen, check, and simply king to e4. And once the king comes back, like the king comes back to d5, the problem is that this queen endgame is drawn. The black king will be able to come back and defend, and unfortunately white is not able to actually win the queen endgame. So what he has to do, what white has to do here, is white has to play that king to c3 move, luring the opponent's king over to the f3 square, because after g4, we have king to d3, and now the king has to come up to f3. We go a5, a6, a7, queen, queen, check. And as you can see, we're able to box out or shoulder the opponent's king, block their king on our path over to the b6 square. We're just 1, 2, 3 away. And as you can see, they're not able to make it. So, in this case, they're 4 moves away, and we're going first. So here we make it quite comfortably, and we make it over to b6. And yeah, we have a winning endgame. So really nice case. This is one of my favorite pawn endgame examples, and it illustrates most of the key points that are useful to be aware of in these kinds of king and pawn endgames. So I really think that these tools are some of the most important things. I mean, the key point that we're relying on is we're relying on awareness. So we're aware, if you're aware of who wins the race, that takes so much pressure off your shoulders when you're calculating these types of endgames. So as long as you're aware of who wins the race and basically where are the opposing kings, and I mean, it's also important to realize, am I stopping the opponent from promoting? But assuming that the kings are nearby, let's say the king is supporting the pawn and nearby, then the main question is just, okay, well, am I winning the race? And where's the opposing king? Because if I'm queening with check, that could be a key tempo that might allow me to win the game. So in almost all of these examples, we saw cases of either straightforwardly winning a race between pawns, or a race for a king to get back to a key drawing square. That was important in some of them. And in this last one, the key was we have both sides queening at the same time, so you can't win that race. You can't actually beat them to it. But with both sides getting a queen at the same time, we are able to actually win it by queening with check, getting the queens off, and having our king box them out. So a lot of different concepts at play here. But I strongly urge you to watch this video a couple times if it's difficult to spot this concept, understand it, and see how to apply it. But the key point is that we have a bunch of different races in all different types of these endings. It can be a race to stop a pawn. It can be a race to get back to a key square. It can be a race for both sides to queen at the exact same time. And when you have that awareness, the main thing is, well, where are the kings for both sides? And when you're aware of all this, I think you'll play these types of endgames much more confidently This was also mentioned, I think this was mentioned briefly in the Kasparov Superclass DVD or Masterclass DVD, and the earliest mention I've seen of this concept dates back to Lasker in the year 1907, and it wasn't really fleshed out so deeply, so this is the way to kind of make sense of it. So we're counting, we're aware of who's winning the race, but not just that. We're also aware of the king position and the influence of the promotion. So if we're queening with check, hey, that one tempo, we could even lose a tempo sometimes, and it may be the difference between a win or a draw. So I hope this was very valuable for you, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.